Vanakkam. Hello friends. As we continue with our exploration into the evolution of early Tamil society from the Iron Age, it is very interesting to note that the material culture as found in the Iron Age megalithic horizon bears a very close affinity to the culture captured in early Tamil poetry. We are referring to the corpus of the Sangam literary works and the earliest extant available work of grammar in Tamil, the Tolgapiyam, which precedes the Sangam works in its timeline. For a long time, the historic value of this body of literature was not taken seriously, and we saw about the different constituents that formed this corpus, as also how the very term Sangam and the concept of the three Sangams were incepted much later into the Tamil world, a good 700 to 1000 years after the works themselves were composed. And only in the past few decades have historians started evaluating the Sangam works, sifting for crucial bits of history. A major drawback also being that the Tamil scholars who are very well versed in these works mostly research the literary aspects, ignoring the historic value, and on the other hand, there are hardly a handful of archaeologists or historians who have the necessary scholarship in Tamil in order to understand and decipher the Sangam literary works. A basic understanding of philology and linguistics is also required, and also the quirks of the Tamil language itself, for example, features such as the Oruborut Panmoli, where there are innumerable words to denote a single object. We saw in an earlier episode of how Veerama Munivar in his Chaduraharadi had compiled 197 terms to denote the sea from these works. Similarly, another feature of the Tamil language where a single word would have a dozen different meanings which one has to understand according to the context, which means the researcher should also be familiar with Tamil culture. Despite these challenges, considerable amount of research has been done by foreign scholars, the likes of Kamil Zwellabil, the Czech scholar in his The Smile of Murugan, and currently Harvard's George Hart, and our own archaeologists and historians from T.G. Vamudan to P.L. Swami to recently Dr. Selvakumar of the Tamil University and Dr. Shantalingam of the ASI, Professor Vedachalam of Madurai Kamaraj University. We see a lot of references where they are correlating recent archaeological evidences to ancient Sangam literature. In order to understand and recreate the history of early Tamil society as well as understand the timelines, including the timelines of the work themselves, multidisciplinary approach, not just archaeology and history, is required. And if we can recap an example that we saw earlier, P.L. Swami, the IAS officer who had done extensive research in Sangam works, in his Zoology in Sangam literature, that is Sanga Ilakkiyangalil Tavaraviyal, mentions a classic example. Tirumurugattruppadai, composed by the poet Nakkirar, is one of the works of the Pattu, and this is the work which for the first time brings together the 6 holy abodes of Lord Muruga, and referring to the first line that describes the abode of Kundruthoradal, that is Tirthani, Paingodi Naraikai Ida Idubu Velan, he shows how Naraikai, that is Jadikai, that is nutmeg in English, was not native to Tamil country, and it was brought into India for the first time during the 6th century from Indonesia. So, citing this as a reason, he opines that Tirumurugattruppadai should be given a much later dating than the Pattu collection itself. Well, with such a large scope for more of multidisciplinary research in order to unearth such important historical facts, we have seen the evolution of the society in terms of the 5 landscapes which are all codified in the Tolgapiyam itself, the 5 Thinais that represent a division of the physiogeographic region of Tamil country, different ecozones, Kurunji, the hilllands and forests, Mullai, the pastures and thickets, Marudam, the riparian plains, Neidal, the coastal tracts, and Palai, the parched lands. Not only did they clearly distinguish between the geographical zones, but also captured the nuances of the people who lived in these different zones. On the basis of their occupations, the hunter-gatherers, the Kuravan Kuratti of the Kurunji hills, who worshipped the warlike god Seyon, the pastoralists, the Idayar who lived in the Mullai land, probably termed as Idayar because they lived in the middle land, that is the Idaipatta Idam, between the hilly regions of Kurinji on the one side and the riparian plains of Marudam on the other side, and they had their dark-hued god Mayon. And then came the agriculturists or the Ulavar of Marudam, who prayed to Vendan, the rain god, or was he Vendan as in king, their ruler literally. The interpretation of Vendan as Lord Indra came a few centuries later. The fierce robbers described as Maravar, who belonged to the Palai regions and who propitiated the bloodthirsty and fearsome Kottravai, and the Baradavar or fishermen of the Neidal, who knelt before Kadalon Varunan, the sea god. Now, these Tinais did not represent any watertight divisions, and there was a lot of migration and movement of people from one region to another region and overlapping of cultures, which also is codified in the Tolhapiyam as Tinai Mayakam. So, given that Tolhapiyam precedes the Sangam literature in terms of timeline, and as of now the Sangam literary works are considered to be composed between the 3rd century BCE and 4th century AD, it is very clear that for the codification to have happened in such clear and lucid terms, people should have been engaged in this kind of a lifestyle for quite a few hundred years before the composition of the Tolgapiyam itself. Now, the time period that we are talking about, somewhere between 1000 BCE and 500 BCE, perfectly overlaps and coincides with the Iron Age megalithic culture. Some of the features deduced of the early Tamil societies, such as Kudi or household and Ur or clan settlement, were the units of social organization. Labor employed for production was largely kin based, meaning that the head of a clan, a kulam, and the classification of a kulam based on the occupations, the kulattoril, though it created a social stratification within the people, it had not obtained the rigid connotation of the caste systems, the jadi divisions that came much later. Thus, the clan represented a large extended family, and it had its leader who organized the production. The production could have been agriculture or pastoralism or craftsmanship or even pottery. And production was often oriented towards subsistence, and at that stage in the society there was hardly a kind of surplus economy. So, what did the people do to mobilize resources? Mobilization of resources was largely through plunder and raid, and it seems that the early Tamil people had perfected the raiding and plundering to almost a level of an art, as elucidated in the Purathineyal of Tolgapiyam, and there is an old Tamil poem that captures the different stages in a raid. Vetchi Nirai Kavardal, Meetal Karandayam, Vatkar Mel Selvadu Vanji, Utkadu Edirundral Kanji, Eil Kathal Nochi, Adu Vazhaithalagum Mulingai, அதிரப்பொருவது தும்பையாம் போர்க்களத்து மிக்கோர் செருவென்றது வாகையாம். So, you first had Vetchi, where a clan went on a cattle raid, and then you had Karandai, where a clan tried to retrieve the stolen cattle. Vanji was the name given for going out to wage war with the opposite clan, while Kanji was the term given to protect oneself against invaders. Nochi was the term given to protect one's fortress, and Ulinge was the term given to go and surround the fortress of an enemy clan. We saw how in Iron Age megalithic settlements there were stone walls that protected a clan settlement exactly from these kind of cattle raids. Standing opposite to the enemy clan and fighting was Tumbai, and one clan emerging victorious was denoted by the term Vahe. Now, all these different terms were named after flowers, and Sangam literature shows how the clansmen at any stage of this war wore the particular flowers. So, this kind of kinship in a clan was of a patriarchal kind and formed the major principle of organization, with reciprocity and patronage being the basis of redistribution. The leader of the clan decided who got what after the raids were over, and even this is given as one of the subdivisions of Vetchi in the Tolgapiyam, denoted by the term Padide. So even though the general ethos of the society was centered on war and clan aggressions, and the leader or war hero was subject to a lot of praise and sometimes in exaggerated terms as found in the Purathinai songs of Sangam literature, there was no organized military army as was found in some of the contemporaneous ancient civilizations of those days, such as maybe in Egypt or Rome. The innumerable hero stones as well as the references to the elaborate procedure of raising and worshipping them that are found in the Sangam literature are further evidence of the general ethos of war and the cult of the warrior hero. Now, this warrior hero or leader became the chieftain. Ferocious fighters also fought as individuals and often attached themselves to a chieftain, and he was also praised in song. Where it was possible, they led these plundering raids into the riparian fields in the Marudam region and sought to control them. These raids and the booty captured in them enhanced their resources. They could now give more gifts and organize more potlatch-like ceremonies. This was a definitive advantage that the chiefs living closer to the agrarian plains enjoyed while compared to those who were in more remote locations. Dr. Kesavan Veluthat, Director, Institute for Studies in the Heritage of Coastal Kerala, the Muziris International Research and Convention Center, points out how these chiefs naturally got greater legitimacy commensurate to the more generous gifts they were able to give and the more elaborate feasts and communal gatherings they were able to organize. Claims staked on the rice-producing plains in the form of these raids graduated to regular control once their potential was realized. Also, in due course, agriculturists themselves should have sought out the protection of these chieftains to protect themselves and their clans against raids, much similar to what happens today, where many businesses align themselves with one political party or the other as a kind of security. Now, all this added to the might of the chieftain. Control of the agricultural plains meant control of the rivers, and these were the arteries that connected the hills and forests to the sea. The large number of ports frequented by overseas traders such as the Romans, who are often referred to in Sangam literary works, lay largely at the mouth of these rivers. The hill products, which formed the bulk of the merchandise, flowed through the ports and beyond through these rivers. Thus, those chiefs who were privileged to have control over the Marudam plains and their produce also had control over the precious items brought in by the Roman traders. Some of the items, as we saw earlier, that were exported from Tamil country were pepper, ginger, cardamom, cloves and similar spices, faunal articles such as animal hides, ivory, apes and peacocks, and wild wood articles of alu, sandal and teak, and precious stones like beryl, pearl and some cotton fabrics. Now, gold and silver is what was received in exchange from these overseas traders in the initial stages, with a little bit of copper, tin and arsenic, as shown by archaeological evidence. Significantly, a major share of these Roman coins found in the archaeological sites in the south come from the hoards and not in the upper levels, and many of them are in mint condition, revealing the fact that they were not commonly used as a medium of exchange. And some of these coins also had a hole at the edge, which means people were using them to be worn as pendants or necklaces. A necklace made of gold coins, a continuation of this tradition that we find today and we wear as the kasumalai. The fact that these Roman coins were used less as a medium of exchange and more as a primitive valuable for its ideotechnic value and for gift giving goes to show that the situation of exchange of goods where ideas of price and profit didn't make much sense to people of the early periods. Well, no regular mechanism for appropriating surplus as tax can be identified, nor does one come across any sort of an administrative agency or statehood in that early period. No trace of what could be described as monumental architecture has also come down to us, like a great bath for the Indus Valley civilization. And while the IVC revealed the existence of a centralized authority with the kind of uniform architecture and the grid layout of its urban centers, as well as the common weights and measures, the uniformity of which were found throughout the large geographical spread of the civilization itself, When it came to Tamil country, the unit that was ruled over by an early leader, the chieftain, was a small nadu, a smaller territory, and the process of urbanization is thought to have started out of external influence and not something that grew organically from within. Living settlements complete with brick architecture, as are revealed by the excavations at Kiradi that are dated to the 5th century BCE, are towards the next stage of the societal development. The superiority of some of the chieftains gained by the twin advantage of controlling the rice producing plains and the transmarine trade set them apart from the less fortunate chiefs and made them more powerful. And it is amidst such chiefs whose lineages would have yielded more and more clout over the passing centuries that somewhere between the end of the Iron Age and the beginning of early history, the foundation for the three great monarchies, the Cheras, the Cholas and Pandyas, should have been laid. Well, they were well established and known by the 3rd century BCE. As we saw in the previous episode, they were mentioned by name by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in his inscriptions. Now, we will continue with exploring how chieftaincy eventually evolved into monarchy and the accompanying developments that happened in the lifestyle of the early Tamil people in the following episodes. Vanakkam.